Given the context of bamboo weapons, Japanese armored columns, and Indian soldiers during WWII, Burma makes perfect sense. The Burma Campaign, 1942 to 1945, saw intense fighting between Allied forces, including large numbers of Indian soldiers, and Japanese forces in terrain filled with dense bamboo forests and jungle. The monsoon rain hammered against the corrugated iron roof of the makeshift command post in Imphal, creating a deafening percussion that matched the chaos of retreat. Lieutenant Arjun Mehta stood before a crude map, pinned to a waterlogged wooden board, his uniform clinging to his skin like a second layer of desperation. Around him, exhausted sepoys from the 17th Indian Division slumped against sandbags, their faces hollow with the knowledge that the Japanese 15th Army was advancing faster than anyone had predicted. It was March 1944, and the British defensive positions in northeastern India were collapsing like dominoes. Arjun had joined the Indian Army 3 years earlier with romantic notions of honor and duty, inspired by his grandfather's stories of the Great War. Now, at 26, those notions had been beaten out of him by the relentless Japanese advance through Burma. He had watched entire battalions dissolve into the jungle, seen men drowning in mud, while trying to drag artillery pieces through impassable terrain, heard the screams of soldiers caught in positions overrun by enemy tanks that seemed to materialize out of the forest like mechanical demons. "Sir, the wireless operator says the Japanese Type 95 tanks have been spotted near Shenam," reported Havildar Ranjit Singh, a Sikh NCO whose normally impeccable turban was stained with dirt and sweat. "Colonel Henderson is ordering a full retreat to the ridgeline." Arjun felt his jaw tighten. Another retreat. Another admission that British military doctrine developed on the plains of Europe was utterly inadequate for this nightmare landscape of vertical mountains, sucking mud, and vegetation so thick you couldn't see 5 feet ahead. The Japanese had adapted, using light tanks that could navigate narrow jungle paths, employing infiltration tactics that turned every shadow into a potential ambush. The Allies, meanwhile, were still trying to fight a conventional war in the most unconventional terrain imaginable. "How many tanks?" Arjun asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't matter. Even one Type 95 was devastating in these conditions. The British anti-tank rifles were ineffective against their armor, and the few anti-tank guns they possessed were nearly impossible to maneuver through the jungle paths. Intelligence estimates at least 6, possibly more. They're using the old supply road that runs parallel to the river. Our scouts say they'll reach the village of Kangpokpi by dawn. Arjun looked at the map, tracing the route with his finger. Kangpokpi sat in a narrow valley, surrounded by steep hills, covered in bamboo forest, so dense it was virtually impenetrable. If the Japanese secured that village, they would control the only practical route to Imphal. The entire defensive line would collapse, and with it, any hope of stopping the invasion of India itself. "What anti-tank capabilities do we have in that sector?" Arjun asked, though he already knew the grim answer. Ranjit Singh shook his head. 2 anti-tank rifles, both with maybe 20 rounds between them. The nearest artillery unit is 15 miles away, on the other side of a mountain. Range, they can't provide support. The other officers in the command post had fallen silent, listening to this exchange with the numb acceptance of men who had seen too many impossible situations. Captain Morrison, a British officer with a bandage wrapped around his head from a recent skirmish, lit a cigarette with trembling hands. "We're bloody well finished," he muttered. "Can't fight tanks with rifles." Something in Arjun snapped. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or the accumulated frustration of watching good men die in a retreating war, or simply the stubborn refusal to accept defeat that his grandfather had instilled in him. "No," he said quietly, "we're not finished." Morrison laughed bitterly. "You planning to throw rocks at them, Lieutenant? Perhaps wish them away?" Arjun ignored the sarcasm and turned to Ranjit Singh. "How many men can we muster who are still combat effective?" "Maybe 40, 50, if we're generous. Most haven't eaten properly in 3 days. And local resources? What's available in terms of materials?" Ranjit Singh looked confused. "Sir, I don't understand. What materials?" "Bamboo," Arjun said, the idea crystallizing in his mind even as he spoke. "The entire valley is filled with bamboo groves. Some of those stalks are thick as a man's thigh, hard as iron when properly dried." Morrison snorted. "You've gone mad from the heat. You want to fight tanks with bamboo?" But Arjun was already moving toward the map, his mind racing through calculations and memories. As a child in Punjab, he had watched village craftsmen work with bamboo, had learned its properties, understood its incredible tensile strength. During his engineering studies at Lahore, before the war had interrupted everything, he had been fascinated by materials science, by the way. Traditional materials could be adapted for modern purposes. Not just bamboo, he said, speaking faster now as the plan took shape. We sharpen the ends, harden them in fire, treat them with whatever chemicals we can find to increase penetration. The Type 95 tanks have relatively thin armor on their undersides and rear sections. If we can create obstacles, channel them into specific kill zones, and attack from above or behind. That's suicide, Morrison interrupted. Even if your bamboo spears somehow penetrated the armor, which they won't. You'd have to get within arm's reach of a moving tank. The machine guns would cut you down before you got close. Not if we use the terrain, Arjun countered, pointing to the topographical features on the map. The supply road passes through a section where the hills rise steeply on both sides. Dense bamboo cover right up to the road edge. We position men in the groves above the road, let the tanks pass beneath them, then strike downward at the weaker top armor and engine compartments. At the same time, we create barriers on the road itself, forcing them to slow down or stop. The command post had gone completely silent now. Even Morrison seemed to be considering the proposal, though his expression remained skeptical. Ranjit Singh, however, was nodding slowly, his tactical mind working through the scenario. It's insane, the Havildar said finally, but so is everything else in this damned war, and it might just work. Colonel Henderson emerged from the back of the command post, where he had been listening to the exchange. He was a career officer of the old school, his face weathered by years in India, his eyes carrying the weight of too many lost battles. Lieutenant Mehta, he said formally, are you volunteering to lead this improvised operation? Arjun straightened to attention. Yes, sir. You understand that I can offer no reinforcements, no artillery support, and no evacuation if things go wrong? You would be entirely on your own with whatever resources you can scrounge locally? I understand, sir. Henderson studied him for a long moment, and Arjun could see the calculation happening behind those. Tired eyes. The colonel was weighing a desperate gamble against certain defeat, measuring one young officer's mad plan against the collapse of an entire defensive sector. Very well, Henderson said finally. You have 24 hours to prepare. Select your volunteers, gather your materials, and set your trap. If the Japanese tanks reach Imphal because your plan fails, the blood will be on my hands as much as yours. But if there's even a chance... He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. Arjun saluted crisply and turned to leave, but Henderson's voice stopped him. Lieutenant, one more thing. Don't get yourself killed trying to be a hero. We need thinking officers, not dead martyrs. I'll do my best, sir. Outside the command post, the rain had intensified to a tropical deluge that turned the ground into a swamp within minutes. Arjun gathered his small group of trusted men. Ranjit Singh, Lance Naik Kumar from Kerala, who could climb trees like a monkey, Sepoy Bashir, who had been a blacksmith before the war, and a dozen others who had proven themselves in the chaotic fighting of the past months. Right then, Arjun said, shouting to be heard over the rain. We're going to do something that will either go down in military history or get us all killed. Possibly both. Who's with me? Kumar grinned, showing teeth stained by betel nut. We're already as good as dead staying here, Lieutenant Sahib. Might as well die doing something interesting. They set out. Immediately, moving through the rain-soaked darkness toward Kangpokpi. The village was only 8 miles away, but the journey took them 6 hours, navigating paths that had become rivers of mud, crossing streams swollen to dangerous levels, and constantly alert for Japanese patrols that might be operating ahead of their main force. They reached the village just before dawn, finding it abandoned, except for a few elderly residents who had been too stubborn or too infirm to evacuate. Arjun quickly surveyed the terrain, confirming what the maps had suggested. The supply road did indeed pass through a natural bottleneck, with steep hills rising on both sides and massive bamboo groves covering the slopes. He divided his small force into work parties. One group, led by Bashir, would scout the bamboo groves for the thickest, straightest stalks. Another, under Kumar's direction, would begin cutting and preparing the bamboo spears. A third team would work on creating road obstacles, camouflaged. barriers that would force the tanks to slow down and bunch together. Arjun himself worked alongside Bashir, examining different bamboo varieties with the critical eye of an engineer. The common bamboo was too flexible, would bend rather than penetrate. But there, higher up the hillside, he found stands of male bamboo, the stalks as thick as telegraph poles, their walls dense and hard. "This," he said, running his hand along one massive stalk, "this is what we need." They cut carefully, selecting only the most perfect specimens, and dragged them back to their improvised workshop in the village. Under Arjun's direction, they stripped away the outer layers, exposing the harder inner core. Then came the critical part, sharpening the tips to wicked points and hardening them in fire. Bashir had set up a forge using an old oil drum and scavenged coal. He heated the bamboo tips until they began to smoke and char, then plunged them into a mixture of animal fat and salt that he had obtained from the village stores. The process created a surface layer that was nearly as hard as metal, capable of penetrating sheet steel if enough force was applied. "It's like making a Damascus sword," Bashir explained as he worked, his blacksmith skills adapting to this unconventional material. Layer upon layer, each one adding strength. The bamboo already has natural fibers running lengthwise. When we char and treat it like this, those fibers become like steel cables. As the day wore on, a stockpile of weapons began to accumulate. They weren't elegant spears, 15 feet long, thick as a man's arm, with tips that gleamed black and deadly in the filtered jungle light. Arjun tested one against a piece of scrap metal they had found, driving it downward with all his strength. The tip punched through with a shriek of tortured steel. "It works," Kumar breathed, his eyes wide. "It actually works." But creating the weapons was only half the battle. They needed to deploy them effectively, and that meant solving a dozen tactical problems simultaneously. How to position men in trees without being spotted, how to coordinate attacks without radio communication, how to ensure that the spears would strike at the right angle and with enough force. Arjun worked through the problems methodically, drawing on every scrap of military training and engineering knowledge he possessed. They would use a system of hand signals and jungle bird calls for communication. The spearmen would be positioned in the bamboo groves approximately 15 feet above the road, giving them a downward angle of attack. They would wrap the bamboo in leaves and vines for camouflage, remaining absolutely motionless until the moment of attack. As night fell, Arjun gathered his men for a final briefing. They sat in a circle in an abandoned house illuminated by a single kerosene lamp, their faces grave in the flickering light. "Here's the situation," Arjun began, unfolding his hand-drawn tactical map. "Intelligence suggests the Japanese column will arrive sometime tomorrow morning, probably just after dawn when the mist is still heavy. That's actually to our advantage. It will hide our positions and muffle sounds. The column is estimated at 6 to 8 Type 95 tanks, possibly accompanied by infantry." He paused, letting that sink in. 6 to 8 tanks against 40 men with bamboo spears. The odds were absurd. "Our ambush zone is here," he continued, pointing to a section of road marked in red. "It's a natural choke point. The road narrows to barely 12 feet wide, with drainage ditches on both sides. I've had teams working all day to weaken the road surface at specific points. They've dug shallow pits and covered them with branches and mud. Won't stop a tank, but might slow them down. We'll have 3 teams. Team 1, led by Havildar Ranjit Singh, will be positioned in the trees on the north side of the road. Team 2, under Lance Naik Kumar, takes the south side. I'll lead Team 3, which will be held in reserve at the eastern end of the ambush zone. Each team will have approximately a dozen spears, plus whatever small arms we have. The attack sequence is critical. We wait until all the tanks have entered the kill zone. I'll give the signal a red smoke grenade. When you see that smoke, you strike simultaneously. Aim for the engine compartments if you can. They're on the rear of the tank and less armored. Failing that, go for the commander's hatch, the observation ports. Anything that looks like a weak point. After your first strike, you drop your spear and immediately withdraw deeper into the bamboo. Do not, under any circumstances, stay to see if you hit anything. The Japanese will saturate the area with machine gun fire. Your job is to strike and vanish." Sepoy Bashir raised his hand. "What if the spears don't penetrate, Sahib? What if we hit them and nothing happens?" It was the question everyone was thinking, but afraid to ask. Arjun met Bashir's eyes steadily. "Then we improvise. We've also prepared fire bottles, crude Molotov cocktails made from kerosene, and bottles scavenged from the village. We have the 2 anti-tank rifles, which may not penetrate frontal armor, but might damage tracks or vision ports. And if all else fails, we fade into the jungle and live to fight another day. This isn't a suicide mission, it's a calculated risk. But even as he said it, Arjun wondered if he was lying to them, and to himself. The truth was that if the bamboo spears failed, if the tanks pushed through and reached Imphal, then everything they had fought for would be lost. The Japanese would control the gateway to India, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Ranjit Singh seemed to read his thoughts. The Havildar stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the lamplight. "Brothers," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had seen combat on 3 continents. "Tomorrow we face steel monsters with wooden spears. This sounds like madness, and perhaps it is. But remember this, the Japanese are not invincible. They are men like us, far from home, fighting in a land they don't understand. Their tanks are machines, complicated and vulnerable. And we," he tapped his chest, "we are soldiers of the Indian Army, sons of a land that has faced invaders for thousands of years and always prevailed. Our grandfathers fought with spears and shields. We adapt, we overcome." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. These men had been pushed to the breaking point, had seen their units decimated, their country threatened, but they hadn't broken, not yet. There was still fight in them, still a stubborn refusal to accept defeat. "One more thing," Arjun added. "Some of you are Hindu, some Muslim, some Sikh, some Christian. In peacetime, maybe those differences would matter. Tomorrow, they don't. Tomorrow, we're just soldiers, brothers in arms, fighting for each other and for the men behind us who are counting. On us to buy them time, that's all that matters." They spent the rest of the night in final preparations. The bamboo spears were carried up into the trees, carefully positioned and camouflaged. The road obstacles were refined and disguised. Fallback positions were identified and marked. Every man checked and rechecked his equipment, going through the rituals that soldiers have performed before battle since the dawn of warfare. Arjun found himself unable to sleep, his mind churning through contingencies and scenarios. He sat on the veranda of an abandoned house, watching the stars wheel overhead through gaps in the clouds. The rain had stopped, leaving the jungle steaming and dripping, alive with the sounds of insects and nightbirds. Kumar found him there, offered him a bidi, and they smoked in companionable silence for a while. "You know what the funny thing is, Sahib," Kumar finally said. "I joined up because I wanted to see the world, have adventures. Seemed better than tapping rubber trees in Kerala for the rest of my life. And here I am, about to fight tanks with bamboo sticks. My grandmother would think I'd gone mad." Arjun laughed softly. "What would she say if you told her?" "She'd probably say that Lord Krishna fought his battles with wisdom and cunning, not just strength. She's a religious woman, my grandmother. Sees God's hand in everything." "And you? Do you see God's hand in this?" Kumar was quiet for a long time, the tip of his bidi glowing in the darkness. "I see a lieutenant who refuses to give up, even when giving up would be the sensible thing. I see brothers willing to stand together against impossible odds. If that's not divine, Sahib, then I don't know what is." Dawn came slowly, creeping through the jungle like a cautious animal. The mist was thick, just as Arjun had hoped, reducing visibility to barely 20 yards. He moved through the ambush zone one final time, checking positions, offering quiet words of encouragement to the men hidden in the trees. They were invisible, these soldiers of his. The bamboo groves swallowed them completely, camouflage and stillness rendering them part of the landscape. Only someone who knew exactly where to look would spot the spear tips protruding from the foliage, ready to strike. Arjun took his position with Team 3, crouched behind a fallen log that offered both cover and a clear view of the road. His hands were steady as he loaded his Lee Enfield rifle, though his heart hammered against his ribs. Beside him, Bashir clutched one of the fire bottles, its rag fuse ready to light. They waited. The sun rose higher, burning off some of the mist. Birds began to call in the jungle, normal forest sounds that helped mask any inadvertent noise from the hidden soldiers. An hour passed, then another. Arjun began to wonder if the intelligence had been wrong, if the Japanese had taken a different route, if all their preparation had been for nothing. Then he heard it, a low rumble, mechanical and ominous, growing steadily louder. The sound of diesel engines and clanking treads, unmistakable and terrifying. He raised his hand, signaling absolute silence. Every man in the ambush zone went completely still, barely breathing. The first tank appeared around the bend in the road, a Type 95 Hago, squat and menacing, its 37mm gun traversing slowly from side to side. The rising sun glinted off its steel hull, still wet from morning dew. A Japanese commander stood in the open, turret hatch, scanning the jungle with binoculars, unaware that dozens of eyes were watching him. A second tank followed, then a third, fourth, fifth. They were spaced about 30 yards apart, their engines growling, treads churning up mud from the road surface. Infantry walked alongside them, maybe 20 soldiers, their rifles held at the ready, but their posture suggesting they expected no resistance. 6 tanks total. The intelligence had been accurate. Arjun waited, his hand on the smoke, grenade counting seconds. The first tank needed to be deep into the kill zone before he gave the signal. If he attacked too early, some tanks might escape. Too late, and they'd drive right through. The lead tank reached the weakened section of road, and exactly as Arjun had hoped, its right tread broke through the camouflaged surface. The tank lurched, its nose dipping, engine straining as the driver tried to power through. The tank behind it slowed, bunching up, and the one behind that. Perfect! Arjun pulled the pin on the smoke grenade and hurled it onto the road. Red smoke billowed up, vivid against the green jungle. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the jungle erupted. From the trees on both sides of the road, 15-foot bamboo spears plunged downward, driven by gravity and desperate strength. The men had been well trained. They aimed for the vulnerable points, engine compartments, commander hatches, the thinner top armor. The Kai. First spear struck the turret of the lead tank with a metallic shriek, penetrating the steel plate and continuing downward. The Japanese commander, still standing in the open hatch, screamed and clutched at the bamboo shaft that had impaled him through the shoulder. A second spear hit the engine compartment, punching through the thin rear armor. Smoke began to pour from the tank. The second tank, caught between its disabled comrade ahead and the tanks behind, was hit by 3 spears. Simultaneously, one missed, glancing off the angled hull armor, but the other 2 found their marks, one through a vision port, another into the engine grill. The tank shuddered, its engine coughing, and began to burn. The Japanese infantry reacted with admirable speed, despite their shock. Machine gun fire raked the trees, bullets shredding leaves and bark, searching for targets. But the Indian soldiers had already dropped their spears and were melting back into the bamboo groves, moving with the practiced stealth of men who had learned to survive in the jungle. The third and fourth tanks, aware they were under attack but unable to see their assailants, began firing their main guns blindly into the tree line. 37mm shells exploded among the bamboo, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. One sepoy, too slow to take cover, was caught by the blast and went down without a sound. But the ambush had achieved its primary objective, sowing chaos and disrupting the column's advance. 2 tanks were disabled, burning and blocking the narrow road. The remaining tanks were trapped, unable to maneuver in the confined space. "Team 3, advance!" Arjun shouted, rising from his position. His reserve force, the men carrying the fire bottles and the precious anti-tank rifles, rushed forward. They moved in short bounds, using the dense bamboo for cover, closing the distance to the trapped armor. Bashir was the first to reach effective range. He lit the rag fuse on his Molotov cocktail, the flame sputtering in the humid air, and hurled it at the fourth tank. The bottle shattered against the hull, spreading burning kerosene across the steel surface. The flames were more psychological than damaging, but they added to the confusion and smoke filling the ambush zone. The 2 anti-tank rifles opened fire, their distinctive crack cutting through the chaos. One round struck a tank's observation port, the armored glass shattering. Another hit a drive sprocket, mangling the metal. These weren't killing blows, but they were degrading the tank's combat effectiveness with each hit. Then something went wrong. The 5th tank, its commander apparently more composed than the others, managed to reverse out of the kill zone, backing up with its gun traversing, searching for targets. It spotted Arjun's Team 3 exposed on the road and opened fire with its machine gun. Bullets stitched across the ground, kicking up geysers of mud. Arjun dove for the drainage ditch, landing hard on his shoulder. The breath knocked from his lungs. Around him, men were shouting, taking cover, returning fire with their rifles, though the bullets bounced harmlessly off the tank's armor. This was the nightmare scenario he had feared, caught in the open, pinned down by a mobile tank that could maneuver and bring its weapons to bear. If they couldn't disable this tank quickly, it would systematically destroy his entire force. Kumar appeared beside him in the ditch, dragging one of the remaining bamboo spears. "Sahib, we have to flank it. If we can get to its side or rear—" "Too exposed," Arjun shouted back over the hammering machine gun fire. "We'd be cut down before we got close." But even as he said it, he saw Ranjit Singh leading a group from Team 1, moving through the bamboo grove above the road, invisible to the tank crew below. The Havildar had seen the same tactical problem and was taking action without waiting for orders. Ranjit Singh's team emerged from the jungle directly behind. The reversing tank, their timing perfect. They carried the longest spears, the ones designed specifically for engine compartment attacks. 4 men, working in coordinated unison, drove their bamboo weapons into the tank's rear grille from multiple angles. The effect was immediate and devastating. The spears penetrated the thin armor protecting the engine, shredding fuel lines and piercing the radiator. Superheated coolant sprayed out, scalding one of the attackers, who fell back with a scream. But the damage was done. The tank's engine seized with a grinding shriek of tortured metal, and the vehicle shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from every opening. The crew bailed out through the hatches, preferring to face rifle fire rather than burn alive in their disabled tank. Indian rifles barked and 2 of the crew went down. The others made it to the jungle and disappeared. Arjun took advantage of the momentary respite to assess the situation. Of the 6 Japanese tanks, 3 were completely disabled and burning. The 2 that had been at the rear of the column had managed to reverse out of the ambush zone and were now sitting back down the road, their guns aimed forward, but their commanders clearly uncertain whether to advance into what had proven to be a deadly trap. The 1 remaining tank in the kill zone, the 3rd in the original column, was damaged but still mobile. Its commander was trying to push past the burning wrecks ahead of him, attempting to bull his way through using sheer mass. "Team 2, Arjun bellowed. "Hit that tank. Don't let it break through." Kumar's team, positioned on the south side of the road, had saved several spears for precisely this moment. They didn't have a perfect angle. The tank's top armor was mostly protected by its turret, but they struck anyway, bamboo spears raining down like javelins from an ancient battlefield. Most glanced off or shattered against the hardened steel, but one, thrown with desperate strength by a young sepoy from Gujarat, found the narrow gap between the turret and hull. The spear jammed into the ring mechanism, and the turret's traverse suddenly locked, frozen in place. The tank commander, realizing his main gun was now fixed in one direction and unable to aim at his attackers, made the decision to withdraw. The tank backed up jerkily, its damaged tracks grinding, and retreated down the road to join its 2 surviving companions. A ragged cheer went up from the Indian positions. They had done it. Against all odds, with improvised weapons and desperate courage, they had stopped a Japanese armored column, but Arjun knew they weren't finished. The 3 surviving tanks, though they had withdrawn, were still combat effective. Their commanders would be radioing for reinforcements, calling up infantry and possibly more armor. This ambush had bought time, maybe a few hours, but it wasn't a decisive victory. "Cease fire," he ordered. "All teams withdraw to Rally Point Alpha. Move now, before they regroup." His men needed no further encouragement. They gathered their wounded, 1 killed and 3 seriously injured, and melted back into the jungle, leaving behind the burning wreckage of 3 Japanese tanks and a road littered with destroyed equipment. As they moved through the bamboo forest, Arjun caught up with Ranjit Singh. The Havildar's turban had been torn by shrapnel, and blood ran down the side of his face from a scalp wound, but he was grinning. "We did it, sir. We actually did it." "We slowed them down," Arjun corrected, but he couldn't keep the satisfaction out of his voice. "They'll be back with more tanks and probably infantry support, but we bought our people time to prepare better defenses." They reached Rally Point Alpha, a small clearing a mile from the ambush site, and took stock. Of the 40 men who had entered the fight, 36 had survived. 1 killed instantly by a tank shell, 3 wounded seriously enough that they would need to be evacuated. Given what they had faced, The casualties were miraculously light. Arjun sent runners back to Imphal with news of the engagement, while his remaining men rested and treated their wounds. Exhaustion was setting in now, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind trembling hands and emotional reactions. Some men sat in silence, staring at nothing. Others talked rapidly, reliving the battle, processing what they had just experienced. Bashir approached Arjun, carrying one of the bamboo spears that had been recovered from the battlefield. The tip was bent and stained with oil and blood, testament to its effectiveness. "We should show this to the Colonel, Sahib. Proof that it works." Arjun took the spear, weighing it in his hands. It was just bamboo, a material so common in this part of the world that people built houses with it, made furniture from it, used it for 1,000 everyday purposes. And yet, properly prepared and employed, it had stopped Japanese armor. "It's not about the bamboo," he said slowly, working through the realization even as he spoke. "It's about understanding that there's always an answer, always a way to adapt and overcome, if you're willing to think differently. The British trained us to fight their way, with their weapons, using their tactics. But this isn't their battlefield, this is ours." A British officer might have called his tactics crude or desperate, but they had worked. More importantly, they had proven a principle, that local knowledge, creativity, and the courage to try something unconventional could overcome supposedly superior technology. Word of the engagement spread through the Allied lines like wildfire. Within hours, other units were asking for details, wanting to know how a small force with improvised weapons had achieved what artillery and conventional anti-tank units had failed to do. The story grew with each retelling, becoming legend, even as the men who had lived it were still processing the reality. Colonel E. Henderson arrived at Rally Point Alpha that evening, accompanied by several staff officers, and surprisingly, a war correspondent who had been embedded with the division. The colonel moved through the group of soldiers, pausing to speak with each man, commending their bravery and innovation. When he reached Arjun, Henderson pulled him aside, away from the others. "Lieutenant, I've received reports from our reconnaissance aircraft. They've photographed the ambush site. 3 Type 95 tanks, completely destroyed, 1 heavily damaged, all with bamboo spears still embedded in their hulls. The Japanese are still trying to clear the road." He paused, and Arjun could see the conflict in the colonel's face, admiration mixed with the institutional resistance of a conventional military mind, confronted with something entirely outside standard doctrine. "What you did was brilliant and insane in equal measure," Henderson continued, "and it's going to cause me an enormous amount of paperwork, trying to explain to High Command how we stopped Japanese armor with sharpened bamboo. But more importantly, it's given our forces the breathing room they desperately needed. The Japanese advance has stalled while they reassess their tactics. We've been able to reinforce the Imphal positions, bring up actual anti-tank guns and establish proper defensive lines." "So we bought enough time?" Arjun asked. "More than that. You've demonstrated that the Japanese are not invincible, that their armor can be defeated even with limited resources. Morale has improved across the entire sector. Men who are ready to run are standing and fighting. That's worth more than you can imagine." The war correspondent, a thin man with spectacles and a notepad perpetually in hand, approached eagerly. "Lieutenant Mehta, I'd like to interview you for my dispatch. The story of how Indian soldiers stopped Japanese tanks with bamboo spears, it's exactly the kind of thing that will resonate with the public back home. Show them that ingenuity and courage can triumph over—" "No," Arjun interrupted firmly. "No interviews, no stories making me out to be some kind of hero. This wasn't about one person. It was about 40 men who trusted each other, who worked together, who refused to give up. If you want to write something, write about them. Write about Havildar Ranjit Singh's tactical brilliance. Write about Sepoy Bashir's skill in creating the weapons. Write about Lance Knight Kumar's courage under fire. They're the story." The correspondent looked disappointed but nodded, scribbling notes. Henderson suppressed a smile. "Spoken like a true officer, Lieutenant, but I'm afraid you're going to have to get used to some attention. Word has already reached division headquarters, and I've been ordered to recommend you for a decoration. The military cross, most likely." Arjun felt uncomfortable with the praise. He had done what the situation required, nothing more. Plenty of other officers in this nightmare campaign had shown equal or greater courage, and many had died doing so. He was simply lucky to have survived and to have had an idea that worked. Over the following days, as the immediate crisis passed and the defensive lines stabilized, Arjun found himself repeatedly called upon to brief other units on the tactics they had employed. He demonstrated the bamboo spear construction, explained the ambush positioning, and discussed the importance of understanding local materials and terrain. Some officers were receptive, already adapting his techniques to their own situations. Others were skeptical, viewing the entire affair as a lucky fluke rather than a replicable tactical innovation. But the important thing was that the mindset was beginning to change. Officers were starting to question received wisdom, to look for creative solutions rather than simply following doctrine. The Japanese, meanwhile, had learned their own lessons from the engagement. Their subsequent advances were more cautious, with infantry screening ahead of the tanks, probing for ambushes. They avoided narrow defiles and stuck to more open ground where possible. In some ways, this was exactly what Arjun had hoped for. By forcing the enemy to move more carefully, to expend time and resources on security, the defenders gained precious days to prepare. 3 weeks after the bamboo spear ambush, as Arjun sat in a forward observation post, watching Japanese positions through binoculars, Ranjit Singh brought news. "Sir, wireless message from division headquarters. We're being pulled out of the line for rest and refit. Weak in the rear, hot food, actual beds. They're also assigning us a new unit designation, Special Tactics Company. Apparently, High Command wants us to continue developing and testing unconventional warfare methods." Arjun lowered the binoculars, surprised. "They're making us official?" "More than that, Sahib. They're expanding the unit. We're authorized to recruit up to company strength 120 men, and we'll be attached directly to division headquarters as a rapid response force. Your bamboo spears have apparently impressed people very far up the chain of command." It was both flattering and daunting. What had started as a desperate improvisation was being institutionalized, turned into doctrine. Arjun wondered if that was good or bad. Would formalizing these tactics rob them of their flexibility, their creativity, or would it allow the lessons learned to be spread more widely, saving more lives? As they prepared to rotate off the line, Arjun took one last tour of the defensive positions they had held. The bamboo groves that had hidden his men still stood, dense and green, unchanged by the violence that had erupted beneath them. The road where Japanese tanks had burned had been repaired, the wreckage cleared away, leaving only scorched earth as testament to what had occurred. He found Kumar, sitting on a fallen log, cleaning his rifle, with the meticulous care of a soldier who had learned that proper maintenance meant the difference between life and death. "What do you think happens now, Sahib?" the Lance Naik asked without looking up from his work. "Now? We rest, we train new men, we refine our techniques, and when the call comes again, we'll be ready. And after the war, assuming we survive." It was a question Arjun had avoided thinking about. The war had consumed so much of his life, had changed him so fundamentally that imagining a world at peace seemed almost impossible. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I'll go back to engineering, build bridges instead of destroying them. Or maybe I'll write a book about what we've learned here, about how small groups of determined people can overcome enormous obstacles if they're willing to think creatively." Kumar smiled. "I think I'll go back to Kerala, find a nice girl, have children, tell them stories about the time their father fought Japanese tanks with bamboo sticks. They won't believe me, of course. It's too absurd to be true. But it is true. That's the remarkable thing. It actually happened." They sat in companionable silence for a while, two soldiers enjoying a rare moment of peace in a war that seemed to have no end. Around them, the jungle breathed and stirred, indifferent to human conflict, enduring as it had for millennia, and would for millennia more. The Battle of Kangpokpi, as it came to be known in official reports, was ultimately a minor engagement in the vast scope of the Burma campaign. The Japanese were eventually stopped at Imphal and Kohima through a combination of conventional military force, logistical problems, and sheer determination on the part of the Allied defenders. The bamboo spear tactics, while effective in that one instance, were never replicated on a large scale. Circumstances and terrain rarely aligned as perfectly as they had that day. But the engagement had demonstrated something crucial, that innovation and adaptability could overcome material disadvantage, that there were no unsolvable problems for men willing to think creatively and act courageously. In a war increasingly dominated by industrial production and technological superiority, there was still room for individual initiative and tactical brilliance. Lieutenant Arjun Mehta did survive the war, though he carried shrapnel scars and the psychological weight that came from leading men into combat. He was indeed awarded the Military Cross for his actions at Kangpokpi, though he never wore the medal publicly, feeling that it belonged as much to the men who had fought beside him as to himself. After the war, he did return to engineering, eventually becoming involved in infrastructure projects that helped rebuild a newly independent India. But he never forgot the lessons learned in that bamboo grove, never lost the understanding that the greatest resource any nation had was not its weapons or wealth, but the creativity and courage of its people. The bamboo spear itself, the one Bashir had recovered from the battlefield, ended up in a military museum, accompanied by a small plaque explaining its history. Visitors would often stop and stare at it, this crude weapon that had somehow stopped modern armor, trying to reconcile the impossible with the real. And in that reconciliation, in the space between the impossible and the real, lay the true story of what happened that day in the jungles of Burma when 40 men with bamboo spears faced down Japanese steel and refused to break.